I don't know, when I think about the biggest, most important economic policy this government, if re-elected, would move forward, you'll forgive me if I don't think about monetary policy. You'll understand that I think about families.
At the beginning of the campaign, Justin Trudeau, pretty much out of the gate, said he didn't focus on things such as monetary policy. Well, if you, like most Canadians, have been going to the grocery store, filling up your tank, or buying stuff for your house, you'll notice that the price has skyrocketed. Today, we have learned that Canada's inflation rate is at 4.1%, the fastest growth we've seen since 2003. Everything from gas prices up 32.5%, poultry, meat, and let's not forget, of course, out west they had a drought, and that too is going to increase costs. Sabrina Maddow is Postmedia columnist, and she's with me. As the election has been rolling forward, sure, there's the jibs and the jabs, but really, Sabrina, it's been all about affordability.
It has. We've seen that cost of living is the top issue by far for voters under 40. Housing affordability is the top issue in the GTA, and there's been a lot of talk about inflation. Certainly the most talk there's been in my lifetime, and Canadians, particularly younger ones, are extremely concerned about how they're going to afford everything from their home or their rent check to meet at the grocery store.
You know, it's been said by many politicians and others in the past that, of course, it's the economy, stupid. But this is truly where the rubber meets the road. This is something that affects you every single day. Every time you walk out of your home or your condo or wherever, go to the grocery store, pick up something for the kids for school, whatever it is, Sabrina, the price has gone up and up and up. And beyond the fact that we have a prime minister who apparently doesn't think about these sorts of things, looking forward to what the other parties have proposed or talk about with respect to affordability, what have you seen emerge?
I think it's been a huge opportunity for the other parties. I think that voters in general, and especially millennials and Gen Z, are fed up with Trudeau. I think that while this generation might have been more focused on social issues when they were younger and they were in university or their early 20s, the fact is millennials are now in their 30s and some are even in their early 40s. They own homes, they're starting families, or they want to, that they're real adults. So all of a sudden, these economic issues, on top of being more pertinent just by the nature of what we're going through, but they're just affecting them more. This is real life stuff. So I think we're going to see a switch in how voters are thinking less perhaps about some bigger abstract issues and more about, like you said, what happens when they walk out their front door and go to the grocery store.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up all of those, shall we say, woke-ish type issues, because Justin Trudeau was recently doing a sit-down interview with Global in British Columbia. Of course, BC, huge, fertile electoral territory. The Lower Mainland is very much in play for all three of the main political parties. But let's just have a look about what Justin Trudeau had to say.
All right, Mr. Trudeau, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much again for your time.
This is an election on big things that we didn't get to talk about. We didn't talk about the pandemic. We didn't talk about climate change. These are the decisions people are taking. This is what people care about in BC.
So Sabrina, my takeaway from that is similar to what you just said with respect to so many of the younger voters, the Gen Z, the millennials. They have their own perspective on social issues. You know, some of us would refer to them as social justice warriors. But now they are moving beyond that because they're becoming taxpayers, they're becoming parents, they have families. And the reality of home ownership is so out of reach for so many of them. But what you saw in that clip was Justin Trudeau responding with things that he wanted to talk about. He didn't want to talk about the very significant things that the Global BC had brought up. How do you think that sort of messaging plays with those young voters who Trudeau relied on in the last election? And then how does it play with this one?
Well, it doesn't look good because it makes him look very defensive and makes him look very self-serving. He only wants to talk about what paints him in a good light, not what necessarily matters to voters and young Canadians. And during that interview, they touched on very important issues, from feminism to Afghanistan to the housing crisis. But unfortunately, those aren't areas that he's performed well in. So he'd rather distract. He wants to talk about climate and about the pandemic. And we've seen, as the Liberals have struggled in the polls and as we near Election Day, he's been ramping up the rhetoric about the pandemic and saying things like, if you want to end the pandemic for good, you have to vote Liberal, which is, of course, absurd in that, A, there's not going to be a day that the pandemic's over for good. We're going to be living with COVID in some form for a while. So to say something like that is disingenuous. But it also just reeks of desperation. And it's unfortunate because he's antagonizing the fringes of society, and also people who are just genuinely frightened or hesitant about vaccines, and putting them further in a corner, pushing them further to the fringes doesn't help anyone. To come out of this, we have to act collectively for the common good. And for him to see him politicizing the pandemic for his own personal gain just leaves a bad taste for a lot of people, including myself.
And I think that's really what so much of this is all about in terms of the broader issue about Justin Trudeau. I think that the Liberals are finding, certainly at the doors, at least what we're hearing anecdotally, is that the country has kind of fallen out of love with this guy. There was the mania and excitement in 2015, and then, of course, his gender parity cabinet and all of this. But many of these issues on particular issues of public policy that matters to people, that matters to the citizens of this country, and not about socks, and not about being popular, not about being on the front of Vogue and all of these other goofy things that have gone on. Canada needs a serious leader. And is your sense that it may not be Erin O'Toole, because some of a certain generation just will never vote Conservative. I understand that. But then there's the NDP, and that's a huge amount of spending that they're going to ultimately have to pay for. Those debt, today's debts are tomorrow's taxes. So how does this sort of unfold? What is the choice out there for those that are looking for all of these things? They're never going to find a perfect political party, but is it an opportunity for the Conservatives?
Like you said, I think that a generation is falling out of love with Trudeau. In fact, I think they're beyond that. It first started with disillusionment. There was a lot of broken promises, everything from electoral reform to when he came out with that cabinet with gender parity. But then, he's constantly throwing strong female leaders under the bus when it suits him. And we've seen broken promises on housing affordability, everything else. So that's translated from disillusionment to distrust to, I think, a real sense of anger and frustration. And anecdotally, what I've heard from people is they just don't want to vote for Trudeau. Yeah. And we've seen that in the polls as well. And millennials are looking for another solution. I think that this has been a missed opportunity actually for the NDP, and I'm surprised they haven't been able to rally and do better in the polls. And a lot of that, I think, comes down to Jagmeet's he has a lack of charisma and energy and fierceness that I think young voters want to see reflected. And I believe, like you said, Erin O'Toole and the Conservatives have seen a huge opportunity, especially as they've pushed forward. They were the first to talk about the housing crisis. They're often the only ones talking about affordability in a serious way. And he's managed to come off as non-scary on a lot of these social issues. He's been emphatically pro-choice. He says he believes in climate change. And I think, unfortunately, maybe some voters just haven't had enough time to get to know him. So I'm not sure if he'll be able to turn out a victory in this election, but we have seen in polling for younger voters that they are becoming more open to voting Conservative, and some have actually switched their support. So I wouldn't write off the millennial generation as a lost cause for Conservatives quite yet.
Sabrina Maddow's pieces you can read in the National Post. Let us know what you think. Is a 4.1% inflation increase on everything with the cost of goods going to make a difference how you vote? Log on to Facebook and Twitter. Let us know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.